When Donald Trump pulled the United States out of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, better known as the Iran nuclear deal, experts quickly interpreted the move as an attempt to force regime change. But barring a military strike, Trump has only a few options, and one of them, so-called secondary sanctions, is far from perfect. Secondary sanctions are economic sticks that support primary sanctions, which restrict domestic entities from doing business with counterparts in a targeted country. Secondary sanctions include asset freezes, trade embargoes, and multilateral pressure. In the US, most secondary sanctions prohibit US persons from doing business with any third party that is directly supporting a sanctioned country. But the perceived extraterritoriality of secondary sanctions has produced heated debates over national sovereignty and international law. While the US began using secondary sanctions during the Cold War, their legality has long been a point of contention. In 1982, President Ronald Reagan signed an order barring foreign subsidiaries of American firms from constructing a natural gas pipeline linking the Soviet Union to European markets. But within a year, European outrage and threats of retaliation forced the Reagan administration to reverse course. Frustration deepened in 1996 when the European Union initiated a World Trade Organization proceeding against the US tied to elements of the Helms Burton Act, which President Bill Clinton had signed to strengthen the US embargo against Cuba. What made Helms Burton noxious to America's European allies was the sanctioning of foreign-owned non-US companies. In other words, the law was intentionally extraterritorial and aimed at forcing behavioral change in a third party. This prompted many countries to develop so-called blocking measures against the US. 2 years later, the US again backtracked. Secondary sanctions regained favor among US politicians after 9/11, with Iran, Russia, North Korea, and Cuba the main targets. Under Trump, their use appears to be on the rise. And according to some, like Robert Kahn of the Council on Foreign Relations, Trump's less than rigorous assessment of the political and economic consequences is deeply troubling. In November 2017, the US Treasury barred US financial institutions from doing business with the Bank of Dandong, a Chinese bank identified as a source of illicit funding for North Korea. In congressional testimony, US Treasury officials admitted that the move was aimed at sending a message to other Chinese banks. But the move so angered Chinese officials that plans to sanction 2 other banks were eventually shelved. That has complicated efforts to exert what Trump has promised would be maximum pressure on North Korea. Today, dozens of countries continue to ignore US and UN sanctions targeting the Kim regime. As for Iran, Trump has vowed to reimpose secondary sanctions that were lifted by the Obama administration after the Iran deal was concluded in 2015. If Trump follows through, European and Asian allies may have no choice but to abandon the deal or risk being frozen out of the US financial system. The irony, of course, is that the Iranian case is perhaps the best example of a secondary sanction achieving its stated goal. Obama achieved a nuclear deal largely because allies supported the secondary economic pressure. And most observers believe a similar approach will be needed to get to yes with North Korea. With no such support for Trump's unilateral efforts, it is hard to fathom how secondary sanctions will achieve anything but finger-pointing.